All right. Well, welcome to the final installment of the Disability as Diversity Book Club. This book club is brought to you by the Docs with Disabilities Initiative in partnership with AHEAD. The Docs with Disabilities Initiative uses research, education, and the sharing of stories to drive change in healthcare education. The initiative aims to build more inclusive educational environments for trainees with disabilities and increase representation of disabled providers in the healthcare workforce. The goal of this Disability as Diversity Book Club was to introduce varied perspectives and encourage empathy for all stakeholders in a health science setting. Over the last several weeks, we have worked through cases empowering DRPs with varied perspectives and resources to boost their confidence, allowing them to work through complex situations. For those who have been actively joining these sessions, thank you. It's been wonderful. My co-facilitators and I today are excited to be here with you, and thank you for choosing to spend the next hour and a half with us. As a reminder, today's session will be recorded. At the end of the case debrief, there'll be time for open Q&A, at which point we'll end the recording to encourage further discussion. We encourage you to participate as we all learn from one another in these settings. Before we get started, one of my favorite colleagues, Sarah Triano, is with us today to share some exciting news. So we'll turn it over to Sarah.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm happy to be here. My name, as Grace said, is Sarah Triano. I'm the co-chair of Access in Medicine, or AIM, as you may know it. So AIM is thrilled to announce that the 2023-2024 book club selection, Demystifying Disability, What to Know, What to Say, and How to Be an Ally by Emily Ladau. So pictured on the slide is the front cover of the book, Demystifying Disability, as well as a photo of its fabulous author, Emily Ladau. We're thrilled to be partnering with the University of Michigan Center for Disability and Wellness and the University of Central Florida to bring you this series. As an exciting addition, the author will join us for the kickoff event in September and a final Q&A at the conclusion of the series. Registration opens next month, and the series will begin on September 13th. This iteration of our book club will be especially helpful for your campus partners, including diversity, equity, and inclusion offices, learning specialists, and academic coaches. As always, captioning will be provided for each event, and the book club is always free. The sessions will be recorded, captioned, and posted to the Docs with Disabilities Initiative website. Speaking of, please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube page to view all previous book clubs, visit our website for updates, and if you have a Twitter, hop on over there and add @DocsWith to your follows. The Docs with Disabilities Initiative is proud to bring you this event and wishes to thank all of the moderators, the expert DRPs who freely gave their time and talents to moderate this event. We're also grateful to you, the audience, for attending and informing us about our collective knowledge. Please enjoy the final iteration of Disability as Diversity Case Study Book Club, and we'll be super happy to see you this fall.
Thank you, Sarah. That's exciting news and something to certainly add to your calendar. All right, so now we'll get started. Today is case 15. This case study is specifically regarding a student who fails the medical board exam, and it was written by Dr. Christina H. Peterson and Dr. Lisa M. Meeks. So today we'll start with some quick introductions. I'm Grace Clifford. I'm currently the Director for Disability Services at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA, and I'll turn it over to Jan.
Mute. Hi, everyone. I'm Jan Sarantino. I'm a former director from a disability office at the University of California, Irvine. I'm currently serving on the DRP advisory board, and I'm an independent consultant assisting students in higher ed health science programs and to either get their programs using best practices or helping them with board exams and accommodations. Christine?
Hi, I'm Christine Lowe. I'm the Director of Disability Services at the Icahn School of Medicine in New York City and on the Board of Directors for the Coalition for Disability Access and Health Science, and also a proud member of AIM with Sarah.
Thank you. I'm also a member of the Coalition Board. I forgot about that, and a member of the DRP Academy. Excited to have this group together to go through this session. So some other thank yous that we wanted to put out there was to the contributing authors to the publication as a whole, as we would not be there or be here without them. We like to take this moment to recognize that all of these cases are based on actual events and true stories, just slightly changed to de-identify the story. So a lot of the students that were involved in these cases actually helped contribute. So and again, a huge thank you to the contributing authors and the editors. I also wanted to take some time to do a special shout out and thank you to a variety of individuals with AHEAD. Again, an amazing partner, always willing to collaborate on these types of initiatives. And we, again, would not be here without their support. So in particular, we want to recognize, the executive director, Stephen Smith, Elisa Laird, Richard Allegra, who has quite often been the individual to kickstart these meetings, Valerie Spears, as well as Christine Liu, who is here with us today. And then an extra special thank you to the captioning team provided by AHEAD, Lachey Flowers, Nancy Rivera, and Michelle Schneider, especially keeping up with a fast talker like me, I know is difficult. So again, huge thank you to AHEAD for always being willing to collaborate and partner on these types of initiatives to kind of spread knowledge and the spirit of networking, even in a virtual environment. For those of you that are interested in more information about AHEAD, if you're not already familiar, feel free to check out their website. So before we get started into the conversation today, we always like to start with some just basic rules and reminders. One is that this is a space for learning and connecting. So no one has all the answers, not even the three of us that are on this panel today, and that questions are really welcome at all levels. So don't, be nervous about, whether or not, your response is accurate, walk through it with us. And if you don't feel comfortable, kind of talking and doing it through being unmuted, feel free to use the chat feature, which we'll talk about shortly. We do ask that people be mindful of their kind of airtime and their contribution time, just to make sure there's enough time for everyone and we can make it through all the slides once we get to the question piece. This unfortunately is not a space for individual consultation regarding current student situations. So if you have those types of questions, connect with me after and I can point you in the right direction. Or, I recommend the Coalition for Disability Access and Health Sciences listserv is a great place for that. And lastly, just to remember to navigate this space with humility and respect. All right, so when it comes time to the questions after we do a review of the case study, there'll be two options for engaging. One, you can raise your hand and I'll monitor that and I will allow you to talk and unmute you. And then you'll be able to just use your microphone and kind of ask your question. The other option is that you can use the chat feature and Christine Lowe will read aloud questions, comments, those types of things. All right, so for the agenda today, we'll start with the key points of the case history. So if it's been a minute since you've read this particular case, we're going to go over kind of the nuts and bolts of the situation with you. We're going to look at the perspectives of the student, the medical school, as well as the DRP. And then we have a set of guided questions and that's where we'll look for you to engage and connect with us. And then we'll open it up at the end for just general question and answers related to kind of health science access. All right, so now we'll turn it over for the case history.
So let's go through the key points of the case history. Our student is Miguel, and he's from a single parent household. He participated in supporting his siblings and received a full scholarship to Lehman College. He graduated with a 3.5 GPA in biomedical engineering, and he took the MCAT twice, and he scored just well enough to gain entry into medical school through a Pathways program for underrepresented students. He started experiencing academic difficulty immediately upon entering medical school, and he was diagnosed with ADHD after a neuropsychological evaluation during his second year. Miguel had to take out a loan to pay for that neuropsychological exam. And after he got the results, he was approved for institutional accommodations. He got time and a half for his exams and also a distraction reduced testing environment to minimize his distractions. And everybody noted immediate improvement in his exam performance after he received those accommodations. The DRP at his school initially discouraged Miguel from applying for board exam accommodations, and he got some misinformation from a friend that led him to believe that the board may flag students who take board exams with accommodations. After failing the board exam by 2 points, the dean at his school pulled Miguel from his rotations and recommended he apply for accommodations, which necessitated him taking a leave of absence. Miguel applied for board exam accommodations while on his leave of absence and was denied. He then took the board exam a second time and failed by 1 point. Now Miguel is facing the school's 3 strikes policy, so he feels increased anxiety and pressure to pass the board exam.
So let's think about Miguel's perspective through this whole scenario. First of all, he's concerned about not being able to get approved for board accommodations. And as you know, there's long wait times once the application has been submitted to receive a decision. So now he needs to take another leave of absence, which presents significant financial barriers. He's not going to have access to his health insurance. He won't have housing. He won't have access to the faculty that have been supporting him, and no access to other campus support services. Obviously, he's going to be frustrated over receiving contradictory advice, not only from the disability resource professional, but the student affairs dean as well. I think, yeah, and then that student who told him about flagging. He's also dismayed that no one from the medical school coached him on how to complete that application for accommodations, which is quite comprehensive. He also is looking at the being dismissed because of the 3 strikes rule. And that is, you have 3 opportunities to pass the boards. And if you don't pass it, you're just out. Obviously increased anxiety around his exam performance. And all along, he's really been questioning whether or not he belongs there and he's good enough to be a doctor. He has concern over losing contact with his peers, his cohort, through the leave of absence. And then also anxiety over having to explain why he's been away from medical school. And obviously embarrassment about the failures, about the board exams when it comes to applying for residency programs.
Thanks, Jan. So now we're looking at the perspective of the medical school in this situation. One, understanding that the students need to demonstrate the proficiency on the boards to graduate. That's an integral part of their program and process. And so it leaves them with a couple of questions. The idea, if the student can't pass the board exams, how will he pass the licensing exams? If the student can't demonstrate proficiency on exams, is he qualified safely to treat patients? Like, does he have the fund of knowledge and mastery of the material that he needs? Can we modify, the medical school, the policies, to keep the student enrolled, financially protected, and covered under the medical insurance? Or could they modify policies surrounding access to campus resources, especially the support services, while on the leave of absence, whether that's disability services or academic support, and not just for this student, they're looking at the precedent being set. So looking ahead and into the future. And then lastly, this idea of the 3 strikes rule, can that be modified due to, a lack of support and some poor advising or misadvice from the DRP?
All right, so now let's look at the perspective from the DRP. One of the things is the discrepancy between the application process for getting accommodations at the institution versus on those board exams. There's also a high caseload, and this is a part-time DRP. It's recommended that the caseload be 1 to 85. So for every full-time DRP, you have 85 students. There's been a lack of training and best practices around board exam accommodation applications and support. And the schools experienced some resource barriers that have kept that DRP from joining national organizations or attending meetings that would help educate the DRP on board exam best practice. The DRP is feeling guilty about suggesting that the student not apply for accommodations, and is a little overwhelmed or confused by the denial letter from the board suggesting that if ADHD was not diagnosed in childhood, a student cannot have a disability. And this DRP has a lack of knowledge about ADHD diagnostics, psychometrics in general, leading to feelings of inadequacy and uncertainty about how best to assist this student in an appeal.
So where do we start in this process? If you were the DRP asked to get involved in this case, what would you do? So you need to figure out, what do you already know? What do you need to know? And how and where might you find new information that might lead to an enhanced access for this student?
And if individuals have initial impressions, you can either put it in the chat, or again, you can raise your hand and we will unmute so you can participate. Any initial thoughts on these 3 questions?
Grace, we have a quiet group. Does that mean we're going to call on somebody?
I'm not a fan
Oh
of
my
cold
gosh,
calling,
I hope
but
you don't have to voluntold somebody.
but while we're waiting for someone to maybe process, oh, actually, I see a hand up. Emily McGee, you are allowed to talk now.
Thanks. I'll start with the what do we know? So we know that this student has only recently received accommodations and is not familiar with the process. We know that they have not been as supported as they possibly could be. We know this student comes from a lower socioeconomic background, which also has an impact on availability of those resources, whether they are provided through campus or just outside availability of resources. I think I would want to know, I guess, were they approved for even, an alternative accommodation? Were they approved for maybe additional breaks? Was there anything, that the student might be able to utilize? And, I'd also want to know, are they working with academic development? Are they trying to work on strategies for, how they can improve their testing if they have to test under that standard time?
Thank you, Emily.
And also remember, there was information about the case from when he was much younger.
Mhm. Yeah. Other thoughts from either attendees or from Jan or Christine before we move on to question 1?
I think another key point that we know is that it's made a significant difference now that he's receiving accommodations, right?
Absolutely.
Well, I'll go ahead and mention that I remember reading in the case study that he had an IEP when he was in school. I can't remember if it was elementary school or secondary school, but if he had an IEP, that means that there was some kind of assessment done way back then that he probably didn't even think about until he was meeting with the evaluator doing the neuropsych, because they would be asking those questions about, elementary school, junior high, or middle school. But without the DRP knowing this information, they wouldn't know how to help him in submitting that information on his application.
Yeah, and I think that's an
So we have
excellent. Oh, go ahead, Christine.
No, you're right. Those are very excellent points. I was just going to chime in because we have some comments in our chat. One of our participants noted that he was evaluated by our neuropsychologist. Another participant mentioned that, oh, sorry, the chat's moving. We know that later in life diagnosis of ADHD is still valid and should not itself preclude the student from eligibility for applying for accommodations. Somebody mentions that they're from an academic background, support background, and they say limp their way through DRP stuff. I would want to know what was included in his original application for MBNE accommodations. Great question. And we want to ensure the student knows how to communicate the reasons why they did not have accommodations in the past clearly and what barriers got in the way. Those are all great thoughts and great comments.
Yeah, because I think a lot of students, that the comment about wanting to know what they submitted before is huge, because students see that certificate of prior test accommodations and then that, accommodation request form, and they think it's really as simple as completing those documents, submitting, and as long as, they have supporting documentation, they'll receive accommodations, similar to hopefully how, they experienced getting accommodations in medical school or in undergrad. And they're really surprised at how many students, if they don't have this robust application, end up with either a full or partial denial. So that's an excellent point. Perfect. All right, let's move on to question 1.
So what types of documentation could best support Miguel's diagnosis of ADHD based on the information that was included in the case? And what might he want to address in his personal statement within an appeal? That personal statement is really, really an important part of that application process. Ooh, I see Sarah's hand up.
So I think it's always difficult because I think we as DRPs can look at a lot of different things, but knowing that what the NBME really is looking for, I'd want to review whatever objective data we have from the neuropsych and highlight if there's specific deficits in processing speed or working memory to be able to specifically tie something noted a deficit with what might the student experience during the exam. So whether that's pulling specific numbers and citing it in my letter of support, and making sure that the student also reiterates the same thing in their personal statement.
Another comment in the chat, in a personal statement, he might mention his cultural background. And Sarah, I'll just chime in and say, I think that you make a really good point. You make several points, but especially about how the DRP can support that student by tying a lot of the information together in that letter of support and highlighting certain things. I think that that's really key for people to keep in mind. And yes, I think in a personal statement, there are several things that the student could highlight about their family of origin, their background, and how that impeded access to things like neuropsych evals. So really, really good point there.
So I'll also chime in a little bit. So we're remembering that he's already taken the test twice. He's already been denied once. And so basically what he would need to do at this point is ask for a reconsideration, or he's going to ask for an appeal of the first decision that was made. So in this case, we already know what they were unhappy about. We know that they feel that, well, he wasn't diagnosed as a child. So we know that we're going to need some of that information, an old IEP, any old indication of what type of supports he was receiving when he had that IEP, to document that he was considered a person with a disability, even if it was a different diagnosis, because at the time and with the resources he may have had, he might not have been diagnosed with ADHD, he might have been diagnosed with who knows what. But irregardless, he had to be diagnosed with something in order to receive an individualized education program document which told about his academic goals and social goals and accommodations received. So my guess is he probably did receive some extra time or a separate location to take his exam if he was having a hard time focusing. So it's going to be very important to get that early documentation included in a reconsideration or appeal for accommodations on the third go round.
Mhm. And I wanted to touch back on the comment regarding the cultural background. I think it's an excellent point and a really, really important one. And I think for many of us, it's something we see a lot, right? Students coming from various cultural backgrounds that might see identifying as having a disability as a major stigma, or, kind of, bring shame on the family. Like there's a lot of kind of baggage that can come with the idea of disability in certain backgrounds. It also can be reasons, even if there isn't that baggage, why they weren't identified. A lot of students who come from under-resourced school districts, or just from, maybe they started school somewhere else, the school might not have been actively looking to identify those students in the same way we might see in a highly resourced district. And so a lot of what I talk about with my students in the personal statement is, tell me the story of growing up in your family. What was it like? Was there self-accommodation to get by? Because there was this, emphasis on family. Like, did your, mom sit at the table with you to help with your focus and concentration and to help you work through things, so that we can highlight that in the personal statement to explain how we got to medical school without formal accommodations, because that's basically the gap we're trying to explain.
There's
Another person added
really
in the
good
chat
comment
that,
in the
go ahead.
chat, Christine.
Yeah, another person added in the chat that ADHD might not be recognized or supported in families from certain backgrounds. And as Grace highlighted, I've seen lots of examples of that where students and parents can be in conflict. Students can be in conflict with themselves. I had a student who described it really eloquently as a training to be a medical professional, talking about, I know what I know, right? I'm learning the chemistry behind some of these things. I understand it better from a biological standpoint, but the way that I was raised, I still feel what I feel. And the student was describing being in conflict with themselves about having a disability diagnosis. And I've seen students who couldn't use their insurance because it was from their families, and the family was in disagreement about the diagnosis or about the treatment plan or about the medications that were prescribed. So all different kinds of things can come up in this context. And again, as Grace stated, I think it's really important to be able to highlight those things in that personal statement and really bring to life. I say to students, this is your opportunity to describe your lived experience, which is different than anyone else's, and to highlight what some of those barriers and hurdles were. I think that's another thing that's hard for our medical students to do. People get to medical school by putting their best foot forward, right? And minimizing challenges that they've had. And so kind of exposing all of those things also brings up issues, potentially related to culture or background, ethnicity, religion, all kinds of things in terms of that stigma that Grace was mentioning earlier.
Yeah. Yeah, and before we move on to question 2, I think the other thing to remember is, if you're in medical school, these are bright, highly driven students. So the ability to self-accommodate, to that extent, to that point, is not as surprising as many might think. Or as it might come up, it's pretty common, but the pace and rigor of medical school just kind of obliterates any ability to self-accommodate. So kind of helping the student validate their experience, as you coach them through the personal statement, can be a really important part of the DRP's role.
I joke with my students all the time that a later diagnosis just proves how smart you are, right? Because you were able to self-accommodate longer and make it work.
I like that reframing. For question 2, to move along, what other types of documentation can support a student in Miguel's situation? So I know Jan touched on, the IEP, but for anyone who's read the Equal Access Guide as well, we talk a little bit about other things that can be utilized to kind of demonstrate a history of a disability or a history of self-accommodation. So what are some things that you have recommended to students to include in a submission? Oh, I see Suzanne has her hand up. Suzanne, you can talk.
Hey y'all, can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I always encourage students to create a relationship with a therapist or a psychiatrist or both early on, particularly just because this is a difficult road to navigate in and of itself. And I just think that's good practice to have for good self-care. And so if a psychiatrist or therapist could provide a letter to support any other additional documentation and they could submit that, I think that is always helpful.
Yeah. Well, and hopefully, you know, the institution that you're at has free, you know, or low cost resources for the student. So this might be a nice way, as Christine mentioned earlier, being on a parent's insurance can be a deterrent to getting help and support that they need, but allowing them kind of alternative ways that maybe doesn't require that use of insurance can be super helpful and a great path forward.
We have a great comment in the chat. Somebody posted a letter from an employer if they provided accommodations in a work setting, which is another great idea.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, you know, that's kind of going on the right path of, you know, the reality is the disability, although maybe most prevalent in the academic, you know, space because we're creating this kind of artificial environment and restrictions, you know, it's still impacting the individual in their everyday life or professionally if they've had a job. So seeing what could be, you know, resource from those areas is really helpful. You know, a lot of the students I initially have, you know, connect with me and say they just have test anxiety. When we do a deeper dive, we find that there's anxiety in other areas of their life, but again, they can self-accommodate in those spaces. Like they're not forced in a situation where their anxiety will spike and there's no way to moderate it. So those conversations as a DRP and helping, like having a set of guiding questions you can use with students to help them think through things that they might not have seen as manifestation of disability impact.
So I'll bring up a couple of items while those of you are thinking of other things. I was really hoping, seeing all these great comments in the chat, I hope some of you will speak up. But other types of documentation, there's two things I'm thinking of. If you remember back in the case study, there was a physician that was supporting Miguel in getting ready to take the MCAT. That person could write a letter to talk about his experience, well, first his background and his experience working with Miguel and what he observed with Miguel. And then secondly, it was noted that his performance in medical school dramatically changed. So what faculty member, the dean, learning specialist, any of those folks who can document in a letter the change in Miguel's performance once he began receiving accommodations, before accommodations, after accommodations. So those would be two types of letters that could be included.
Yeah. I just put in the
Yeah,
chat.
I would add too that, oh, go ahead, Grace.
Oh, I was gonna say, I just put in the chat too. I see some DRP Academy grads here today, so encouraging them to share knowledge, as I know this is something we talked about as well in the on-ground experience. But go ahead, Christine.
I was just going to say, to Jan's point, the DRP could also do that, right? In their letter of support, there are lots of elements that they could pull together. And in looking closely at the neuropsych report that was done, looking at the hard numbers that were given in terms of where some of the deficits or challenges or barriers might be, and then also tying that to the improvement that was seen in the medical school once he got accommodations. I think that that's one way that the DRP could kind of help tie some of those things together in a support letter for Miguel.
And I'll share, you know, I've had some students that, you know, were just highly involved, in undergrad, in high school. So, if they were late diagnosed, I would say, hey, is there anyone you still connected to either in your undergrad space or in high school that in retrospect, if you come back to them and say, I was just diagnosed with X, they can be like, that actually makes sense. Like, although you were high achieving and like, we did a lot of off the book things for you. Now I recognize why that was needed. It wasn't because you were overextended. It was, because of some of those attentional things. So I have had high school English professors, write letters for students and talk about how very much they could, the things they saw when they had this student and how they recognize now that could have been signs of a disability missed. And then they could speak to any informal accommodations or the way they saw the student self-accommodate themselves in that space. So again, it kind of gives support to the idea of, yes, we might have diagnosed it here, but it was present long before.
Yeah, Grace, you're echoing some of my thoughts in terms of students that I've helped reach back out to previous teachers or therapists or coaches, a variety of different kinds of people who may have given a student extra time. Just to give a different example outside of school, I had a student reach back out to a coach. This was a student who was very active in a particular sport over a long period of time, and he was actually really great at it. But this particular student was describing that in his sport, what was typical was for a coach to kind of scribble a play on a whiteboard. And the student had to be able to recognize that representation and where they were in the X's and O's, right? And then implement what they saw on the whiteboard on the field. And he said that his peers were able to do that in under a minute, right? The coach would pull them aside and scribble it and send them back out. And it took him like an extra minute. And the coach wasn't necessarily always happy about having to spend that extra minute, but recognized that he was a good player. And if he was given a little bit of that extra attention, he could then put into practice what was written on that whiteboard. So that was an opportunity to demonstrate how this impacted him outside of school in terms of it being a substantial impact in other domains of his life.
Yeah. And I think a coach is another great resource and one I hadn't thought about before, because that's another individual, right, that would have worked really closely with an individual, been with them kind of outside typical school hours. They end up becoming kind of almost, family or, surrogate parents and things like that. So I think that's a great option. I'm going to move on to question 3, and I think that's going to be the one that gets everyone really excited and really engaged. And it's a 2-parter, so hopefully.
As the assisting DRP, what would you include in the Disability Resource Office letter of support for Miguel and his appeal for accommodations? And then part 2, how is an appeal different from the initial application for accommodation? What needs to be addressed? What additional documentation should be provided?
And some of this, I think,
people are already chiming in.
Ooh, but I love
it. We create letters of support for each student applying for accommodations, specifically for step 1 and 2, and include student accommodation court cases that relate to the student's situation, offering more of a justification for the accommodations. Great idea.
Especially in this one where there is the cultural component, because there's some specific guidance, I can't remember from which organization, that talks about using culturally appropriate practices when it talks to late identification of disability and ADHD specifically. They say, you can't just use the DSM-5 criteria in quite the same way. You have to use culturally appropriate practices when you're applying those. So that's an excellent approach.
Also, just that you have the time to write those support letters for every student that's applying for their step accommodations. That's great. Not all offices are staffed to be able to do that. So that's terrific.
Other comments? Like I always.
Suzanne has her hand.
Oh, I had the chat up and missed that. Sorry. All right, go ahead, Suzanne.
I am lucky enough to have 2 psychologists in my office who have a long history of writing psychoeducational evaluations. And so when I'm helping a student with an appeal, I have had one or both of the psychologists write a letter with and in a couple different cases, they have actually discussed how the the interpretation of the data was, in their opinion, incorrect. And so they provide a really nice correction to say, your review of this documentation is factually incorrect, and let me share with you why, and let's look at these numbers. And I just always love that, because I'm not a psychologist and I don't have the power to say, boom, here you go with some data. But that's one huge benefit I have that I do when someone's when we're appealing.
Mhm. Well, and I think that's an important point. And when you don't have like somebody on staff to do that, that's where I really look to support the students' providers who wrote the documentation. Because not only do they have that background that they can do that point counterpoint, but also, and more importantly, they have the knowledge of that particular student. And there is specific legal guidance that speaks to, you have to give, kind of
Deference.
thank you, to the individual who did an individualized assessment and has a history with that student. You coming in as a secondary advisor and in kind of armchair quarterbacking it and second guessing is not appropriate, nor in alignment with the ADA's expectations of determining reasonable accommodations. So when you don't have the ability to have some individuals on staff that can do that, taking it back to the provider to say, how can I help you in drafting a letter for this appeal, whether that's looking it over, because they are really finicky about language. So if they say something's a benefit rather than a need, that they're going to hone in on that. So I make time to talk to the providers because I know they're going to be the best person to respond to that. And if it ever kind of, had to go a step higher, I know from a legal perspective, that rebuttal from them is going to be the strongest possible step forward.
So stepping in again, we want to remember that this is different than an initial application. And so it's so important in this reconsideration or appeal that there is new information provided. And that new information can come from multiple sources. The old IEPs from compulsory education can be added to this. The letters that we spoke about. The thing that is probably also going to be needed is an updated personal statement. When you as DRPs meet with the student, you are engaging in that interactive process. You are able to ask lots and lots of questions, and you have time to review documentation and make your best decisions and are able to justify your accommodations. But when NBME or COMLEX or NBOME look at this application, they don't have that interactive process time. And so it's important to talk about all the face-to-face hours that people have had with this student who have seen how the accommodations work, who have seen the impact of the disability, who have seen the evaluation results or performed the evaluations. All those people are those who actually engaged in the interactive process and spent face-to-face time. And that was what Grace was referring to in that case law. It's that face-to-face, people who've had those face-to-face hours and time with the students, their evaluation opinion matters more than NBOME or NBME evaluators' opinions. And so that can be put into the letters as well.
Yeah, and something to kind of add on to that, when we say face to face, that also can be, and I've seen this in the submissions I've been working through, that can be via Zoom. It's about kind of that one-on-one connection. There was a period of time where people said, if assessments were done virtually or interactions were virtual, like somehow, that didn't count in the same way. And that has not been my experience. Students who have done distance evaluations and, do telehealth are still able to use that documentation successfully to get accommodations.
Grace, do you think we need to move along a little bit? We're kind of getting short on time. I want people to be able to ask their questions too.
Yeah. And we go till 5 Eastern. So,
Okay.
All right. Question 4.
So if you recommend faculty letters of support as part of the reconsideration submission, what information should be included and how would you support the faculty in this process? Grace, where's all the raised hands?
I don't know. I'm scrolling through.
I'm waiting for some DRP folks Academy folks to weigh in. I'd love to hear this.
Or the chat. The chat works too. While I'm waiting for a volunteer, I can say I quite often, it's actually kind of standard as part of any appeal process, I ask our dean of students in the medical school to write a letter of support. And so they usually will pull their record, look at kind of the improvement, pre and post accommodation, talk about, like, our students very hands-on with, our dean of students is very hands-on with students. And he'll talk about his interactions with them, and that will be part of the submission with the appeal, as a letter from him supporting not only that the student is eligible for accommodations and what they've seen, but they add in a bit that also talks about kind of the trust they place in the DRP that they've selected to be knowledgeable in this space, and kind of backing up my position, because I usually have a pretty detailed kind of counterpoint to anything that was in the denial or partial denial. And so, I found that dean's letter has been incredibly helpful, and we work together to create a template where they can plug and play that information, and it doesn't take them that long to create.
That's great, Grace. And I think you make a really valid point in terms of the point counterpoint, right? So if the faculty, back to this question, if the faculty can address any of those issues, any of the things that were in the MBNE denial letter, as you mentioned, when I'm working on an appeal for a student, the first thing I do is really read and reread that MBNE denial. What are the points that they used to deny the student, and who are the best people to provide counterpoint to those opinions, and kind of divvy them up. So, are there any points in the student's denial letter where the faculty could get involved and describe the things they've seen related to the disability impacting the student, or again, the difference in the student's performance before and after accommodations? I think that would be an important part of how the faculty could contribute.
And I quite often use that, like if there's a statement made in the personal statement, and they're like, oh, the difference pre and post in like the anatomy lab, or, in a particular block, I'll say, let's connect with that instructor to see if they'd be willing to write something like it fits in our narrative then. And I saw there was a comment in the chat from Jackie.
I missed that one. Sorry. I think it's important to give a template or outline of a letter of support with the faculty to make sure that the information being shared is focused on the access the accommodations have provided in their courses. Yeah, excellent.
Yeah, an excellent point. Because especially what the things I find are, one, they don't know exactly what to talk about. So me making it as easy as possible on them is a huge benefit. And by creating a template I can share with anyone, it makes my life a little easier as well. The other thing I see is that sometimes it's helpful for them to see my letter and for me to talk through real quick, like, are there any legal ramifications? Like they get nervous about if there is a litigation around this, will they be pulled into that conversation? What would that look like? And I really kind of break that down for them and explain kind of how some of that division happens. And so you'll see like their anxiety level lower and they're like, yeah, absolutely, let's do this then. And so you get a much greater buy-in when you walk them through the process. And I'm always willing to de-identify and show them examples of like the language I use, from past cases. So to make sure they're not getting any of the sensitive disability information about the student. All right, some more in the chat, it looks like.
Jan was acknowledging Jackie from being a DRP
DRP. Yeah, sorry.
Academy grad. So
Awesome.
it sounds like we have other DRP Academy grads in the audience. So we'd love to hear from you.
I'll just add one more comment before I think we're to go on to the next question. But sometimes when there's different points in the denial letter, I'll kind of divvy out the points to different people so that a different person can address one or two of the points so that it's coming from multiple locations. So the dean might address two issues, the therapist might address two issues, the evaluator might address the a couple of things, and maybe a parent, because sometimes parents can be really helpful. So getting multiple people to focus on the same thing as well as in the updated personal statement.
Yeah, and I think it makes it easy on the student to help them understand that too, that like who is the best person to speak to that bullet point, because it's that little bullet point at the end of the letter. So I like that description, Jan. All right, question 5.
So what steps can the DRP take to better assist students in preparing their board accommodation applications in the future?
So thinking if you were the supervisor of this DRP, or if the DRP reached out and says, because they did mention in the case, they felt really, really guilty about saying it wasn't worth the student's time to do it. They probably weren't going to get it just to study really, really hard. If they reached out to any of you on this, this group today, where would you point them, or how would you help them kind of gain skills in this area?
Also, it makes me think about their recognition that they have a lack of training in certain areas, right? And I've had access issues themselves to opportunities to learn more about this. So, what kinds of resources could you refer them to?
Yeah, and think about where you went to feel more secure in this area, or maybe that's why you're here today for this particular case. We have a quiet group today. Ooh, somebody in the chat.
Here we go. So utilizing the step timeline table that Lisa Meeks made. Yeah, so I think she put it out initially as the University of San Francisco as a UCSF template, and then it's also in the book, the guidebook. So that template can be really helpful and can be modified to be used with, in accordance with your school's requirements. So one of the things that we've talked about in some of the other like webinars and talks that we've done is it's really important for a DRP to know what their school's policies are. So for instance, at ICON, step exams used to be progression requirements. You used to have to take them in a certain amount of time in order to move forward in your training. When COVID hit, those were changed, and now they're graduation requirements. So we've had some real dramatic differences in terms of when students are testing, also the order in which students are testing. I've had some students flip them and take step 2 before they take step 1, which never used to happen. I've had students postpone them and take both exams kind of back to back in a scholarly year. So knowing what those policies are and kind of adapting that timetable. We have someone else in the chat says, joining groups like the Coalition for Disability Access and Health Science Education to learn from the listserv and the symposium. Yes, that's a great resource for folks. If you can join the coalition and get on that listserv, you have access to lots of professionals who can walk you through individual kind of queries about particular situations. And then that symposium is a great place to learn about kind of the application process in general.
Yeah.
Apply for the DRP Academy, somebody says in the chat. Yeah,
Yes.
shout out for the DRP Academy.
Yeah. So, and some shameless plugs. The symposium this year will be virtual for the coalition. And actually, I will be presenting with Charles Wiener, who is one of the attorneys that has successfully litigated against the NBME and some of their practices. And we'll be talking about how to help students with navigating this process, things to include, and what are the things that tend to be stickier points to navigate, including like if a student is English as their second language or something like that. And so that's the virtual symposium is happening in June, 3rd week of June. I can't remember the exact dates at this moment.
I'll pull them up.
Thank you. I'm on the planning committee. That's a little shameful, but and then the DRP Academy this summer, the application cycle will be starting for that. So, start talking to your supervisors now and see if this is something they'd be willing to support. There's a couple individuals on here that are DRP grads from this year. If you're interested in connecting with a past grad or with me, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to talk about that, but start getting that on your supervisor's kind of radar for potential support. Other things you can do. Oh, something else in the chat.
Yeah,
thank
so
you,
the
Christine.
Coalition Symposium is June 21st and 22nd. We decided to make it half days, so it's going to run in the afternoon, 12 to 5 Eastern Standard Time. So, make modifications to that time frame based on your location. I'm excited, and I'm excited to see shameless plug. I'm excited for Grace and the talk that she's going to do with the attorney. I think that's going to be a really good talk to attend.
Yeah, and there will be a new NBME guide coming out that'll also talk about some of the flexing that's going to happen in that timeline, both because of COVID, as Christine mentioned, but also because the ability to take step 1 after step 2 now. So that's kind of throw things into cattywampus as well. But I think we can move on to question 6 here in a second. But if this is something that, you're feeling like this DRP, feel free to reach out, engage in discussions like this. I think helping students navigate this process is one of the kind of stickiest, ickiest moments of a new health science DRP. Especially to do it well takes time and practice, but a lot of it comes down to developing a good template. And that's something I'm always willing to assist individuals with doing. And there's a lot of great resources in the Equal Access book that I think Jan and Christine have mentioned. So, feel free to check out those resources, because once you get those templated letters down, your life becomes a lot easier.
Yes.
Okay, so our last question that we have for you is, how could the institution have worked proactively to ensure that students with disabilities receive accurate information regarding board exam requirements? What can you do to make changes?
Oh, I have so many ideas. Come on, guys. Shout it out.
Yeah.
Well, I guess, should I hop in? I'll hop in with a couple of ideas and maybe we can get people talking.
There's a chat.
Faculty. Oh,
We've got one.
good. So ask to present during a step preparation meeting to firsthand share what the process is. Yes, Emily, I'm totally on board with you. I was just going to talk about faculty training, right? One of the things I joke about at school is that it seems never ending, right? We have new faculty come on and go off. People take on different roles, and that means they have different responsibilities. They're involved in different things. And then, people just forget, right? If this is not your bread and butter, it's not something that you're thinking about every day. And so people forget. I think one of the important things for me when I started the office at Icon was to really, I want the faculty and the school to see me as a resource, right? So I also want faculty to feel free to, ask me questions, come to the office. We do that in a lot of different ways virtually too, right? Through email and phone calls and stuff, because people don't always have the time to do stuff in person. So lots of faculty training. Somebody else put in the chat, I'm creating an anonymous list so I can track patterns and progress of which students got approved for what accommodations in the past. That's fantastic. Great idea.
Yeah, it's great data points also to have, because I mean, somebody says what's probably but good 65 to 70% of my job. A lot of it is helping students through this process, or writing letters or writing appeal letters.
One of the things that I would like institutions to do, as some are doing, is in the acceptance letter, when the student receives that letter, there's always a lot of information in that letter. And that's a great time to for the letter to acknowledge that they expect that there's going to be students with diverse population, a diverse cohort, and that including students with disabilities attending. And here is the information for getting started with a specialized DRP right from the very beginning, and also having the DRP from the very beginning, talking to the student about that timeline that someone else mentioned in the chat, starting to collect their documentation, and gathering that information, so the institution can really help with that welcome letter or acceptance letter, also in the handbooks, to be regularly mentioning certain resources, including disability services.
I see something in the chat. And in orientations, have the DRP present. Oh, I see, that's you, Christine.
Yeah, I was just saying, in line with what Jan was talking about, in orientations, when the matriculated students come in and they get those orientations about how the school works and all of the things they need to know and the rules and the resources, make sure that the DRP is there. I think one of the most important things is just having students be able to see my face, right? I think it kind of demystifies the DRP office. I don't bite, I'm friendly, come and talk to me. I know you're busy, but make time, and I'll make time for you. And then, as Jan said, every time I do an intake with a student, I also talk to them at that initial intake about, let's talk about if you think you might want to apply for accommodations for your step exams, and let's set up another meeting so we can really go through that and get you started in that process right away, so that it's not like high pressure, high stakes, trying to do that at the last minute, pulling all that, all of those packet components together in a rushed way. Something else in the chat.
Yeah, there's
sorry, go ahead,
one
Grace.
earlier that I want to make sure we didn't miss, from Jasna, which says, when should students start preparing their application, and how much time does it take? Jan, do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I know you and I were working on that.
Sure. So right now, I'm working with 2 students at 2 different medical schools, who are it's going to be an appeal, and has been denied twice, has failed twice. The other one is just starting to make that process, but she has a deadline of June or July. The other one has a deadline of September. And so we have to really work diligently to pull this together, and we will, but this also takes away time for them preparing. This is their study time. So by doing it now, it's really stressful for the student. Typically, if a student can start gathering their documentation after that meeting that Christine was talking about. Start with a folder on their desktop that says USMLE or complex accommodations, and they put their documentation that they submitted to the DRP in there. And then when they go home at Christmas, you know, gather report cards and IEPs or any old documentation to upload to their desktop file folder. That's just a great start. I know others recommend doing that personal statement very early. And that's good, except for that they don't know in all the ways. You know, they probably will have trouble in anatomy, but as they're going later and doing shelf exams, you know, what accommodations were helpful for that or not helpful, what that they needed. But really, 6 to 10 months is not too long.
No. Yeah.
I mean, those who plan early are have maximum study time. And this is, if they don't do it early, that's really what it impacts. And so 10 months, a year, starting on that process.
You know, and I think especially like it's important to remember the way you have to frame the disability impact in your personal statement or the student's personal statement is really, it's draining emotionally. Like it can bring up things that the student hasn't thought about in a really long time, especially if they're defending a history that wasn't documented. You know, you can't frame it as this has been really difficult, but I've come up with a lot of ways to, you know, kind of work around it, because then the NBME will go, cool, then you're good, right? And so instead they have to, without embellishing, be very honest about the disabling impact and look at it from a more place that's a little bit more negative than what they're used to. So, you know, with my students, I offer to meet with them a couple times to develop it. I used to do like one longer meeting, and I found that both of us were just drained by the end of it. So by breaking it up, it made it a little bit more palatable to the student. I think, you know, with the timeline, like 9 to 10 months is always like my sweet spot, as I refer to it. But I also communicate to students that if you were diagnosed later, if you are just being referred to me, if you really took a long time to admit that this was impacting you to the point that you needed this, like, come still talk to me. Let me see, you know, how we still can work together to do this. Because one of the things that happens is that students do hear that it takes a really long time. It's really difficult. There's not high success rates. You know, all this lore gets created. And so people just avoid the process, which perpetuates the inequitable kind of determination process. So, you know, by making it really, you know, the information readily available to students and making myself readily available to students, I find they're more willing to engage in the process and have some hope. And it takes a little bit of a burden off of them. I also actively communicated with anyone on campus that might be a source of documentation. So our health center, in particular, our counseling center. So, you know, I talked to them and said, you know, would you be willing to be a documentation source, you know, for this, you know, or should we really be pushing students elsewhere? And then I told them what's entailed. I told them why it's important. I shared data and research about what happens when students don't have accommodations on these exams. And even for them, I was correcting some of the folklore out there about you're not going to get accommodations, don't bother, you know, in all of those pieces. I could share my data in my past experience. And so they also, as providers, could be talking about it with the student, which is important, because a lot of what they talk about in counseling isn't necessarily what's going on academically, unless that's the main point of their stress. It's usually like interpersonal relationship, you know, things. So it also encourages them to make sure to talk through that so they can document for them in a meaningful way.
Yeah, one of the other things I also did for our counseling center was talk to them about some of the pitfalls that can occur in documentation, because it seemed like we were spending a lot of time kind of going back and forth. And sometimes a student is kind of stuck in the middle of that process, right? Where a provider has given a letter that maybe has some language that's not strong enough, or is not specific enough in terms of what the barriers are, especially from a counseling center or from a mental health background. People are used to keeping that information private, right? And not putting those things in letters. And so having me meet with that center and the director and the staff there and talk about the MBNE guidelines and what's required in terms of documentation helped resolve some of those issues. And then students weren't in that position of feeling stuck and also feeling a little bit additionally stressed by having to go back to a provider and saying, I need more, or I need something different. I need you to do this again. And being worried about what that would do in terms of their relationship with that provider. There's something else in the chat. It says, have students offering step-by-step directions regarding the requirements and how to apply for step 1 accommodations. They may be accommodated themselves, so it offers their perspective.
Yeah, so I know like our student group on campus who were present before I came, actually advocated for my position. They do this. They offer support to peers. They share email templates when they're getting the runaround about the response time and things like that. And they share de-identified personal statement templates. So that's a great idea. If you're also interested in creating a timeline yourself to put on the website and want some, assistance with that, feel free to reach out to me. I have documents I've shared in past presentations, because that can be super helpful as well. Before moving on to kind of the exit pieces, I also wanted to bring up neuropsych evaluations, like being really aware that, they are expensive. They're not always covered by insurance. They're quite often not covered by insurance. Like for us, students who use like the Medi-Cal insurance instead of the UC ship, which is the school stuff, quite often nothing is covered under it. And so, it can be a major barrier, and it's one that is more likely to happen to students coming from, diverse backgrounds, under-resourced school districts, things like that. And so talk to your institution about what resources exist to either connect them to knowledgeable kind of psychometricians, because I've had individuals write those, and then the language they use, it makes it almost worthless or counterproductive to what we're trying to do. As well as ones that maybe work with students on cost or payment plans, or even better, if you can work to have some kind of scholarship or funding, or create in-house low cost or no cost neuropsych, because it really ends up being like a privilege-based barrier for many of our students.
I'm going to put one resource in the chat for training for faculty and supporting students with disabilities. So that's also free, short videos on different topics.
Awesome. Thanks, Shan. All right. So some just exit items before we get to the open Q&A. If you're interested in purchasing this book, we always recommend checking your campus library. Quite often it is available there free, potentially even digitally, or you can purchase it through our publisher's website. In terms of the references and resources for today, there's a number of things, including the UCSF faculty series that Jan shared. We've talked about the Docs with Disabilities podcast, and then the AAMC actually has a number of webinars that are great as well. And Jan will be popping these links in the chat here shortly. The Docs with Disabilities Initiative website would be a great place for you to find information about the next book club. When the DRP Academy applications launch, it'll be there. Plus, they just have a million great things going on. So be sure to check that out. Another resource is the Coalition for Disability Access and Health Science Education, which Christine and I are currently on the board of. And if you're interested in learning more or getting more involved, or contributing to a subcommittee, let us know. We're happy to share the wealth and share the work. And Jan is actually a past president, and one of the founding members of that group as well. And then again, a huge thank you to AHEAD. We could not do these types of events at no cost, without them and their amazing captioning team that keeps up with my rapid rate of speech. So the new book club website will be coming soon. As like I said, it'll be on the Docs with Disabilities website. For that, that's where the registration will be when that launches. That'll be the discussion questions posted in advance, as well as some of the facilitator names. And now we open it up to all of you for your questions.